Imagine a man so strong he could tear apart lions with his bare hands, carry city gates for miles, and defeat entire armies alone. Now imagine if that man never fell, never lost his power, and changed the course of human history forever. What if the greatest warrior who ever lived had kept his divine strength and reshaped the world as we know it? What if everything you thought you knew about history, religion, and the modern world was built on the single moment when Samson's hair was cut? And what if that moment never happened? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. 3,000 years ago, in the hills of ancient Israel, a child was born who would either save his people or watch them fall into slavery. His name was Samson, and his story begins on a night when angels walked among men. Chapter 1. The Lion Slayer's Birth. The woman had given up hope. For years, she and her husband Manoah had prayed for a child, watching other families grow while their home remained silent. But on this particular evening, as the sun set over the hills of Zorah, something impossible happened. A stranger appeared at their door, tall, radiant, with eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "You will have a son," the angel declared, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority. "But this child will be different. No razor must ever touch his head. He must never drink wine or touch anything unclean, for he will be set apart for God from birth, and he will begin to save Israel from the Philistines." Manoah trembled as he realized they stood before a messenger of the Almighty. When he asked the angel's name, the being replied, "Why do you ask my name? It is too wonderful for you to understand." Then, as Manoah prepared a sacrifice, flames erupted from the altar, and the angel ascended in the fire, vanishing into the heavens. 9 months later, their son was born. They named him Samson, meaning little sun, never knowing that this child would shine brighter than any warrior in history. As he grew, it became clear that God's hand rested upon him in ways that defied understanding. Young Samson could lift stones that required teams of men to move. He could outrun horses and bend iron with his fingers. The Philistines had ruled over Israel for 40 years, crushing any sign of rebellion with brutal efficiency. They worshipped Dagon, their fish god, and believed their military might prove their deity's superiority. But they had never encountered anyone like Samson. The boy who would become legend was growing stronger every day, and with him grew Israel's hope for freedom. Chapter 2. When Gods Walk Among Men. By the time Samson reached manhood, stories of his strength had spread throughout the land like wildfire. The first legend began near Timnah, where a young lion attacked him on the road. Most men would have fled or died, but Samson grabbed the beast with his bare hands and tore it apart as easily as ripping cloth. When he returned days later, he found that bees had made honey in the lion's carcass, a sign that sweetness could come from strength. The Philistines learned to fear him when he made a riddle from this event. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. When they cheated to solve it, Samson's anger burned like fire. In a single day, he killed 30 Philistine men to pay a debt, moving through their ranks like death itself. Witnesses said his eyes glowed with divine fury, and his strength seemed to multiply with his rage. But it was at Lehi where Samson's legend truly began. 3,000 men of Judah, terrified of Philistine retaliation, came to capture him. "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us?" they pleaded. Samson allowed them to bind him with new ropes, but when the Philistine army approached, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him with power that shook the earth. The ropes snapped like burned thread. Samson grabbed the fresh jawbone of a donkey and waded into the army of 1,000 men. For hours, the battle raged as one man fought an entire military force. When the sun set, 1,000 Philistine warriors lay dead, and Samson stood alone among them, not even breathing hard. The jawbone in his hand had never broken. Later, when the Philistines tried to trap him in Gaza, Samson simply picked up the city gates, posts, bars, and all, and carried them 40 miles to the top of a hill. The message was clear. No prison could hold him, no army could defeat him, and no plan could overcome the power that flowed through his veins. The Philistines realized they faced not just a man, but the very strength of God made flesh. Chapter 3. The moment that never was. In our world, this is where Samson's story takes its tragic turn. Delilah, the woman he loved, would discover his secret and cut his hair while he slept. But what if Samson had been wiser? What if love hadn't blinded him to danger? In this timeline, Delilah tried her deception 3 times, just as she did in our history. First, she claimed fresh bowstrings would bind him. Samson played along, letting her tie him up before breaking free when Philistine soldiers rushed in. "You lied to me," she accused. But Samson only smiled. He was beginning to understand her game. The second time, she used new ropes. Again, Samson pretended to be weakened, then shattered his bonds when the trap was sprung. Delilah wept and pleaded, "How can you say you love me when you won't share your secret?" But something in her tears felt false, and Samson's heart began to grow cold. The third attempt involved weaving his hair into a loom. As Delilah worked, whispering words of love, Samson noticed shadows moving outside the window. Philistine soldiers waited in the darkness, and he realized the woman he trusted had sold him to his enemies. When she finished weaving and called out, "The Philistines are upon you," Samson stood and pulled away the loom, his hair intact and his strength undiminished. "Did you think the source of God's power could be stolen by tricks and lies?" he asked softly. Delilah's face went pale as she realized her deception had failed. The Philistine soldiers fled rather than face his wrath, and Samson walked away from the woman who would have destroyed him. His hair remained uncut, his vow unbroken, and his strength as mighty as ever. For the first time, Samson understood that his power wasn't just about physical strength. It was about wisdom, discernment, and staying true to his calling. God had tested him through Delilah's betrayal, and he had passed. Now, instead of using his strength for personal revenge, he would use it to free his people once and for all. Chapter 4. The Unbroken Champion. With his strength intact and his purpose clear, Samson became more than a warrior. He became a military genius. No longer fighting alone in fits of rage, he planned systematic campaigns that would break Philistine power forever. He began with their coastal strongholds, appearing at city gates like a force of nature. At Ashkelon, he didn't just defeat the guards, he demolished the walls themselves, pulling down massive stone blocks with his bare hands. The sight of their mighty fortifications crumbling like sand broke the Philistines' will to fight before battles even began. Word spread faster than Samson could travel. Entire Philistine garrisons abandoned their posts rather than face the man who could tear apart armies. In Ashdod, citizens fled so quickly they left their belongings behind. The great temple of Dagon stood empty, as even the priests decided their fish god couldn't protect them from Israel's champion. But Samson's greatest victory wasn't just physical destruction, it was psychological warfare. He would appear at a Philistine camp at dawn, alone and unarmed, and simply stand there. The terror in his enemies' eyes was worth more than any weapon. Sometimes they would flee without him lifting a finger. Other times, he would demonstrate his power by uprooting trees or crushing boulders, then offer them a choice: leave the land of Israel or face the consequences. Most chose to leave. Those who stayed to fight discovered that fighting a man with divine strength was like fighting an earthquake or a hurricane, forces of nature that couldn't be reasoned with or defeated. Samson could throw spears through multiple enemies, lift chariots over his head, and move through armed formations like they were made of straw. Within months, the Philistine military machine that had oppressed Israel for decades was completely shattered. Their trade routes were cut, their cities abandoned, and their armies scattered to distant lands. For the first time in 40 years, Israelite children played without fear, and their parents worked their fields without looking over their shoulders for raiders. Chapter 5. The God King of Israel. Victory over the Philistines was just the beginning. As news of Samson's triumph spread throughout Israel, tribal elders began arriving at his camp with a proposal that would change everything. They wanted him to be their king. "The judges before you were wise," said the elder from Ephraim, bowing low before Samson's tent. "But wisdom without power cannot protect us. You have shown that God's strength flows through you like no man before. Unite the tribes under your rule, and Israel will never bow to foreign masters again." Samson stood silently for a long time, feeling the weight of decision. He remembered Samuel's warnings about kings, how they would take sons for armies and daughters for servants. But he also remembered 40 years of slavery, children sold to pay Philistine taxes, and Israelite men forced to fight in foreign wars. Perhaps a king with divine strength could be different. "I will not rule for my own glory," Samson finally declared. "But if God wills it, I will be your shield and sword." The elders rejoiced, and within weeks, representatives from all 12 tribes gathered to acclaim Samson as Israel's first king. The ceremony took place not in a palace, but on the battlefield where he had defeated 1,000 Philistines, with the jawbone of a donkey as his scepter. Under Samson's leadership, Israel transformed rapidly. The scattered tribes, who had barely cooperated before, now moved with unified purpose. He established a standing army, but not like other nations. His soldiers were motivated by faith rather than fear, fighting for their homes rather than conquest. Jerusalem became Israel's unshakable capital, its walls strengthened by Samson's own hands. No foreign army dared approach a city defended by a man who could topple mountains. Trade flourished as merchants no longer feared bandits on the roads. Farmers prospered as their harvests were no longer seized by foreign tribute collectors. Most importantly, Israel became a beacon of justice. Samson's court became legendary for its fairness, where the poor could receive justice against the rich, and no bribe could corrupt the king whose strength came from God rather than gold. Foreign diplomats arrived weekly, seeking alliances with the nation that seemed blessed by heaven itself. Chapter 6. The Empire That Never Fell. Within a decade of Samson's coronation, Israel had transformed from a collection of oppressed tribes into the dominant power of the ancient Middle East. The king's supernatural strength had become the foundation of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River and beyond. The Philistines who remained became vassals, paying tribute and serving in Samson's armies. Their expertise in ironworking and shipbuilding, once used to oppress Israel, now served to strengthen it. Philistine ports became Israeli naval bases, and their trading networks carried Israeli goods across the Mediterranean. Egypt, the ancient superpower, sent ambassadors bearing gifts of gold and ivory, seeking peace with the nation that had humbled the Philistines so completely. The pharaoh himself wrote to Samson, "Your reputation reaches even to the banks of the Nile. Let there be friendship between our peoples, for we have heard that your God fights your battles." From Babylon came scholars and merchants, eager to establish trade routes through Israeli territory. They brought spices, silk, and knowledge in exchange for safe passage and Israeli protection. The great kings of Mesopotamia, who had never acknowledged Israel's existence, now competed for Samson's favor. The most remarkable transformation was architectural. Using his supernatural strength, Samson personally oversaw construction projects that rivaled the pyramids. Massive stone blocks that would have required hundreds of men and complex machinery were moved by the king's hands alone. Jerusalem's temple, built during this era, featured stones so perfectly fitted that not even a knife blade could slip between them. Cities throughout Israel sprouted mighty walls and magnificent buildings. Roads carved through mountains connected distant settlements. Harbors were dredged and expanded to accommodate the growing maritime trade. The kingdom's infrastructure became the marvel of the ancient world, drawing visitors from distant lands who came simply to witness what divine strength could accomplish. But perhaps most importantly, Israel's military reputation made actual warfare unnecessary. No nation wanted to test their armies against a king who could defeat thousands single-handedly. The very existence of Samson's power became a deterrent that brought peace through strength, exactly as the angel had promised his parents decades before. Chapter 7. When prophecy changes course. The rise of Samson's eternal kingdom created ripples that shattered the biblical timeline as we know it. In Bethlehem, a shepherd boy named David continued tending his father's flocks, never destined to face Goliath or become king. The giant warrior served in Samson's army instead, his size no match for supernatural strength, but useful for intimidating enemies who might consider rebellion. Without David's psalms of persecution and exile, Hebrew poetry developed along different themes. Songs of victory and celebration replaced laments of suffering. The beautiful words, "The Lord is my shepherd," were never written because David never experienced the terror of fleeing from King Saul. Instead, he composed simple pastoral songs about peaceful flocks in peaceful fields. Solomon, David's son, who never became king, grew up as a merchant rather than a ruler. His legendary wisdom was never tested in royal courts or recorded in Proverbs. The temple that bore his name was never built because Samson had already constructed a more magnificent house for God. The Queen of Sheba visited Jerusalem, but she came to marvel at Samson's strength-built wonders rather than Solomon's wisdom. Most significantly, the messianic lineage shifted completely. Prophecies about a coming king from David's line became obsolete because Samson's dynasty provided the eternal rulership that Israel needed. The promises to David about his throne lasting forever were transferred to the house of Samson, creating an entirely different theological framework. Jewish genealogical records, so crucial to later claims about Jesus' royal heritage, traced back to Dan rather than Judah. The Lion of Judah remained a symbol without a throne, while the tribe of Dan, rose to unprecedented prominence. Religious scholars developed completely different interpretations of messianic prophecy, focusing on divine strength rather than suffering servanthood. The consequences extended beyond Israel. Neighboring nations, witnessing God's obvious blessing on Samson's kingdom, began converting to Hebrew worship in unprecedented numbers. The God of Israel was no longer seen as a tribal deity, but as the supreme power of the earth, proved through his champion's invincible strength. Chapter 8. The Religions That Never Were. Christianity, as we know it, faced a completely different world. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he entered a reality where Israel was a powerful, independent kingdom rather than a Roman province. The political and religious landscape that shaped his ministry was unrecognizable from our timeline. The Roman Empire, instead of ruling over scattered Jewish communities, found itself negotiating with a sovereign Israeli state that commanded respect through divine power. Roman legions, the terror of the ancient world, had learned to avoid Israeli borders after witnessing what happened to armies that challenged Samson's descendants. This created a very different context for Jesus' teachings about kingdoms, power, and resistance to oppression. Jesus' parables about kings and kingdoms took on new meanings when spoken in a land ruled by a divinely appointed dynasty. His words about rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's had different implications when spoken to citizens of an independent nation rather than Roman subjects. The entire framework of liberation theology shifted when the audience was already free. The crucifixion itself might never have occurred. Pontius Pilate, governing a small Roman enclave rather than the entire region, lacked the authority to execute citizens of an allied kingdom. Jesus' trial, if it happened at all, would have taken place in Samson's courts under Israeli law rather than Roman jurisdiction. Islam faced equally dramatic changes when Muhammad received his revelations 6 centuries later. The Quran's references to Jesus, Moses, and biblical events were colored by this alternative history. Stories of ancient Israel's strength and divine favor created different theological emphases in Islamic teaching. The concept of jihad developed differently when Muslims weren't conquering former Jewish territories, but negotiating with an established Jewish kingdom. The Crusades, those defining conflicts between Christianity and Islam, took completely different forms. European Christians had no need to recapture the Holy Land because it had never been conquered in the first place. Instead of fighting Muslims for control of Jerusalem, they found themselves seeking pilgrimage rights from Jewish authorities who controlled Christianity's birthplace. Chapter 9. The Crusades That Never Happened. Medieval Europe's entire religious and political development followed radically different paths without the Crusades driving Christian expansion. The warrior monk orders like the Knights Templar never formed because there was no Holy Land to recapture. Instead, European Christianity focused its missionary energy on northern and eastern frontiers, converting Vikings and Slavic peoples without the militant ideology that characterized crusading culture. The relationship between Christianity and Judaism evolved along completely different lines. Instead of centuries of persecution based on deicide accusations, Christians found themselves seeking favor with the guardians of their sacred sites. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land required negotiation with Jewish authorities, creating a very different dynamic between the faiths. European trade routes developed differently as well. Without the need to bypass Muslim control of Eastern Mediterranean ports, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa focused on Atlantic exploration centuries earlier. The age of exploration might have begun in the 1200s rather than the 1400s, with Christian Europeans seeking alternative routes to Asia that avoided both Muslim and Jewish territories. The intellectual development of medieval Europe also shifted. Without the influx of Arabic texts captured during the Crusades, European scholars had to seek knowledge through diplomatic channels. This led to more peaceful academic exchanges between Jewish, Christian, and Islamic centers of learning. The University of Paris negotiated scholarly exchanges with Jerusalem's academies, creating a different foundation for medieval philosophy and science. Most intriguingly, the military technology that developed from crusading warfare never emerged. Medieval armor and castle-building techniques evolved for different purposes. European armies developed to face northern barbarians and eastern nomads, rather than disciplined Muslim forces, creating entirely different military traditions. The cultural impact resonated for centuries. Epic poems like the Song of Roland told different stories of heroism and faith. Courtly love traditions developed without the romanticized imagery of knights fighting for Christ in distant lands. European identity itself formed around different conflicts and achievements. Chapter 10: The Holocaust Prevented. Perhaps the most profound difference in this timeline was the fate of the Jewish people themselves. Without the diaspora that scattered them across the globe, Jews maintained their connection to a sovereign homeland throughout history. This fundamentally altered the dynamics that led to centuries of persecution and ultimately the Holocaust. Jewish communities in medieval Europe existed as citizens of a recognized nation rather than stateless minorities dependent on royal protection. When European rulers faced financial difficulties, they couldn't simply expel their Jewish populations, because doing so risked diplomatic consequences with a powerful ally. The concept of the wandering Jew never developed because Jews had never lost their homeland. The economic restrictions that forced Jewish communities into money lending and other resented occupations were unnecessary. With trade networks extending from their sovereign territory, Jewish merchants operated as representatives of an allied power rather than vulnerable minorities. This eliminated much of the economic resentment that fueled anti-Semitic movements throughout European history. Religious persecution took different forms as well. The accusation that Jews were responsible for Christ's death carried less weight when spoken against citizens of the nation where Christianity was born. Blood libel accusations were harder to sustain against people whose homeland welcomed Christian pilgrims. The theological justification for Jewish suffering as divine punishment collapsed when Jews clearly prospered under divine blessing. The rise of nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries created different pressures. European Jews weren't seen as foreign elements within emerging nation-states because they already had their own ancient nation. The question wasn't how to assimilate Jewish minorities, but how to maintain diplomatic relations with their homeland. When the Nazis rose to power in the 20th century, they faced a completely different situation. The Holocaust depended on Jewish communities being isolated, stateless, and defenseless. A sovereign Israel with millennia of independence and military tradition would have presented an entirely different challenge. The logistics alone would have been impossible. How do you implement genocide against citizens of an allied nation? Chapter 11: The Lost Gospels Speak. Hidden in ancient libraries and sealed chambers lie texts that speak of alternative realities, forgotten timelines, and suppressed truths. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945, contains mysterious sayings that seem to reference Samson's eternal kingdom. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. Takes on new meaning when considered alongside stories of supernatural strength moving massive stones. The Nag Hammadi library reveals Gnostic traditions that interpreted Samson not as a failed judge, but as a type of eternal Christ, a figure whose divine power never diminished because he never fell from grace. These texts speak of the strong one who does not weaken and the Nazarite whose crown is never removed. Scholars who study these documents in secret whisper that they describe a timeline where physical strength and spiritual power remained united. In the caves near Qumran, archaeologists have discovered fragments that don't match our known biblical texts. One scroll, labeled 4Q372 by researchers, describes Samson's kingdom lasting until the end of days and mentions the sons of strength who will rule from Dan to Beersheba. Another fragment speaks of the temple built by mighty hands, where no tool of iron was heard, because the king's strength was sufficient. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves books that never made it into Western biblical canons. The Book of Enoch describes watching spirits amazed by the son of Manoah, whose strength never failed, and the king whose hair grew white with age, but whose power never diminished. These texts describe Samson as one of the great patriarchs, whose dynasty would prepare the way for the Messiah's coming. Most intriguingly, the Acts of Thomas, found in Syrian monasteries, contains accounts of the apostles' journey to a kingdom of strength in the east, where the descendants of the lion killer still reigned, and the temple needed no human architects because divine hands had built it. The text describes Thomas's amazement at seeing stones fitted so perfectly that mortal strength could never have moved them. Chapter 12. The Vatican's Secret Files. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in archives that few living souls have seen, lie documents that the Catholic Church has guarded for centuries. These papers speak of theological controversies that would shake the faith of billions if they were ever revealed to the world. A letter dated 380 AD from Pope Damasus I to Emperor Theodosius mentions the Samson problem, debates about whether divine strength was superior to divine grace as a sign of God's favor. Early Christian theologians struggled with the implications of Samson's continued reign. If God blessed him with unending power, what did that mean for Christian teachings about suffering, humility, and the cross? The Council of Nicaea's unpublished proceedings reveal heated arguments about including Samson's dynasty in messianic prophecy. Some bishops argued that Jesus fulfilled different prophecies than expected because Samson's line had already fulfilled the royal promises. Others insisted this was heretical thinking that undermined Christ's unique role. The winning side declared such discussions dangerous to faith and order. A 12th century papal bull, never released publicly, forbids Catholic scholars from speculating about alternative biblical timelines, or what might have been if the Nazarite's vow had never been broken. The document suggests that some medieval theologians had developed elaborate theories about parallel spiritual realities that threatened Orthodox doctrine. The most shocking document is a report from Jesuit missionaries in 1654, describing their encounter with a Jewish community in Ethiopia that claimed descent from Samson's kingdom. These Jews possessed genealogical records, architectural techniques, and religious traditions completely unknown to European scholars. The missionaries' report was classified immediately and its authors reassigned to remote missions where they could never speak of what they had discovered. Modern documents are even more troubling. A 1962 Vatican study group investigated temporal anomalies in biblical archaeology after discovering artifacts that seemed to contradict accepted chronology. Their final report, sealed by order of Pope John XXIII, concludes that certain physical evidence suggests alternative historical sequences that cannot be reconciled with established doctrine without fundamental theological revision. Chapter 13. Islam's Alternative Timeline. In the hidden libraries of Islamic scholarship, ancient texts preserve traditions that speak of a different history, where the children of Israel never lost their strength or their homeland. These documents, carefully guarded by secretive scholarly societies, describe Quranic verses that might have been revealed differently if Muhammad had encountered Samson's kingdom rather than scattered Jewish tribes. The Hadith collections contain mysterious references to the strong believers in the West and describe the Prophet's dreams of visiting the kingdom where Allah's strength never departed. Some Islamic scholars interpret these as visions of an alternative reality where divine favor manifested through physical power rather than spiritual submission. A 9th century manuscript from Baghdad describes the Caliph Harun al-Rashid receiving emissaries from Mamlakat Shamshun, the kingdom of Samson. The delegation reportedly demonstrated feats of strength that amazed the Abbasid court and spoke of a land where Allah's power flows through the bloodline of the Nazarite. The manuscript was declared heretical because it suggested divine favor could be inherited rather than earned through faith. Sufi mystical texts from the 13th century interpret Samson's uncut hair as a metaphor for maintaining connection to divine source energy. They describe meditation techniques for developing Shamshuni strength, not physical power, but spiritual resilience that never weakens. These practices were eventually suppressed because they seemed to promote Jewish religious concepts within Islamic spirituality. The most controversial document is the Lost Surah, a text discovered in 1923 in a Damascus mosque's hidden chamber. Written in archaic Arabic, it describes Allah testing His chosen people through strength rather than suffering, and speaks of the kingdom that endures because its foundation rests on divine power. Islamic authorities immediately declared it a forgery, but linguistic analysis suggests it dates to the earliest period of Islamic writing. Modern Islamic scholars continue to debate privately whether alternative Quranic revelations might exist in parallel realities. Some Pakistani and Indonesian theologians have developed theories about temporal hadith, traditions that describe events from timelines different from our own. These discussions remain carefully hidden from public view to avoid charges of heresy. Chapter 14. The Hindu and Eastern Connections. The ancient connections between Middle Eastern and Eastern religions reveal surprising parallels that suggest universal spiritual truths transcending cultural boundaries. Hindu texts describe figures whose divine strength mirrors Samson's story in ways that cannot be mere coincidence. The Mahabharata tells of Bhima, whose supernatural strength came from divine blessing and whose power never diminished throughout his life. Like Samson, Bhima could defeat armies single-handedly and perform feats that defied natural law. Hindu scholars note that both figures represent the archetype of divine strength maintained through spiritual discipline rather than lost through moral failure. Buddhist texts from the 3rd century BCE describe the concept of unchanged power, spiritual strength that endures because it remains unattached to worldly desires. Some Buddhist philosophers interpret Samson's story as an example of what happens when divine power is preserved through wisdom rather than lost through attachment. The fact that he kept his strength suggests enlightenment rather than failure. Zoroastrian texts speak of Ahura Mazda blessing certain warriors with Kvarena, divine glory that manifests as invincible strength. The parallels to Samson's story are so precise that some scholars suspect cultural exchange between ancient Israel and Persia that went far deeper than previously understood. Persian fire temples preserved oral traditions about the strong judge of the Western lands, whose power came from the supreme god. Chinese Taoist texts describe the principle of Wu Wei, effortless action that comes from alignment with natural forces. Masters of Wu Wei could perform seemingly impossible feats through harmony with the Tao. Some Eastern philosophers suggest that Samson represented this principle in action, strength that flowed naturally because it aligned with divine will rather than human ambition. The most intriguing connection comes from Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, where texts describe parallel dharma, different manifestations of universal truth across various timelines. These monks speak of meditation techniques that allow glimpses into alternative realities where enlightened beings chose different paths. Some claim to have seen visions of the kingdom of eternal strength, where physical and spiritual power remained united throughout history. Chapter 15: The Forbidden Archaeological Evidence. Across Israel and the surrounding regions, archaeological discoveries continue to unearth evidence that challenges our understanding of ancient history. These findings, often suppressed or explained away, suggest a level of technological and architectural achievement that seems impossible for the time periods involved. In 1967, during construction near Hebron, workers discovered massive stone blocks fitted together with precision that rivals modern engineering. Each block weighs over 50 tons, yet they're assembled without mortar in patterns that have withstood earthquakes for millennia. Official reports attribute them to Roman construction, but carbon dating of organic materials found in the mortar gaps suggests they're at least 1,000 years older. The Tel Dan excavations have revealed fortress walls constructed with megalithic stones that show evidence of being shaped by enormous pressure rather than tools. Stress analysis indicates forces that would require industrial machinery or strength far beyond normal human capability. The site's archaeologists noted privately that it appears these stones were squeezed into shape by hand, which is impossible. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the Judean hills have identified geometric patterns beneath the surface that suggest extensive tunnel systems connecting ancient cities. These passages are carved through solid rock with mathematical precision that seems to defy the technology available 3,000 years ago. Israeli authorities have restricted access to these areas, citing security concerns. DNA analysis of ancient remains from supposed Israelite sites shows genetic markers that don't match known population movements of the ancient Middle East. Some samples display genetic variations that suggest isolated population development over much longer periods than historical records indicate. One geneticist described the findings as consistent with a stable, non-migrating population that maintained genetic integrity for millennia. The most controversial discovery came in 2003 when a construction project near Jerusalem uncovered a chamber containing stone tablets with Hebrew inscriptions that don't match any known biblical texts. The tablets describe architectural techniques and record-keeping systems that seem far too advanced for ancient Israel. The Israel Antiquities Authority immediately classified the find and removed all personnel involved in the discovery. Chapter 16. The Modern State of Israel. In our world, the State of Israel was established in 1948 after nearly 2 millennia of Jewish diaspora. But what if Jews had never lost their homeland? How would the modern Middle East look if Israel had maintained continuous sovereignty since Samson's time? The Palestinian question would never have existed because there would have been no Arab conquest of Jewish lands to displace populations in the first place. Instead of competing nationalisms, the region might have developed as a multi-ethnic kingdom where different peoples lived under Jewish sovereignty but maintained their own cultural identities, much like the Ottoman Empire's millet system, but established thousands of years earlier. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War would never have occurred because there would have been no Israeli independence to oppose. Instead of refugee camps and displacement, Arab populations would have been integrated into an ancient kingdom's social structure. The concept of Palestinian nationalism might have developed along completely different lines, perhaps seeking autonomy within an established kingdom rather than opposing a new state. Modern terrorism, motivated by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, would have taken different forms. Without the narrative of displaced Palestinians fighting to reclaim lost lands, extremist movements would have found different justifications and targets. The entire framework of Middle Eastern violence might have centered on different religious, ethnic, or political divisions. International law would face completely different precedents. The United Nations wouldn't be dealing with competing claims to the same territory, but with an ancient nation whose sovereignty predated most modern international legal principles. Israel's borders wouldn't be subject to negotiation because they would be based on millennia of continuous control rather than recent conquest or international mandate. The broader Arab world's relationship with Israel would be fundamentally different. Instead of viewing Israel as a European colonial implant, Arab nations would be dealing with an indigenous Middle Eastern power that had always been their neighbor. Regional dynamics might have developed around balance of power rather than existential conflict. Most importantly, the psychological framework of both peoples would be completely different. Israelis wouldn't carry the trauma of diaspora, persecution, and vulnerability. Palestinians wouldn't carry the narrative of dispossession and exile. Both peoples might have developed different national identities based on cooperation rather than conflict. Chapter 17. Technology and Divine Power. In our modern age of scientific materialism, how would humanity react to encountering genuine supernatural strength? If Samson's descendants maintained their divine power into the 21st century, it would force a complete re-evaluation of everything we think we know about reality, physics, and the nature of human potential. Military strategists would face unprecedented challenges. How do you plan conventional warfare against opponents who can literally tear apart tanks with their bare hands? Nuclear weapons might lose their deterrent effect against people who could potentially survive direct hits through divine protection. The entire concept of mutually assured destruction breaks down when one side possesses genuinely supernatural defensive capabilities. Scientific institutions would be thrown into chaos. The discovery that certain humans could violate the laws of physics would require fundamental revisions to our understanding of reality. Research programs would shift towards studying divine genetics, attempting to isolate whatever biological factors allow supernatural strength to manifest. The Nobel Prize in Physics might go to whoever could explain how Samson's descendants generate energy from seemingly nowhere. Medical science would face similar disruption. If genetic testing could identify the Samson gene, ethical questions would arise about genetic modification, selective breeding, and human enhancement. Should parents have the right to genetically modify their children to possess supernatural strength? Would insurance companies discriminate based on divine genetic markers? Religious communities would experience crisis and revival simultaneously. Atheist arguments would collapse in the face of demonstrable divine intervention in physical reality. But traditional theological frameworks would also require revision. How do you maintain doctrines about faith being more important than works, when some people clearly receive divine blessing through bloodline rather than belief? The technology industry would race to understand and potentially replicate supernatural capabilities. Could artificial intelligence achieve the computational power needed to manipulate matter at the quantum level? Might advanced robotics eventually match divinely enhanced human strength? The implications for human labor, military applications, and social structure would be staggering. Most disturbing would be the social consequences. Throughout history, physical power has determined social hierarchy. The emergence of genuinely superhuman individuals would create new forms of inequality that no political system is designed to handle. How do you maintain democracy when some citizens possess the physical strength to overrule any majority decision? Chapter 18: Global Religion in Crisis. 3 billion Christians, nearly 2 billion Muslims, and 15 million Jews currently organize their lives around religious traditions that would be fundamentally different if Samson had never lost his strength. The revelation of an alternative biblical timeline would send shockwaves through every major faith community on earth. Christianity would face its greatest theological crisis since the Reformation. If Jesus came to establish a spiritual kingdom, while Samson's dynasty provided temporal rule, traditional doctrines about Christ's unique kingship would require complete revision. Millions of believers who base their faith on Jesus as the promised Davidic king would struggle to understand their Savior's role in a world where political messianism was already fulfilled. The Protestant emphasis on salvation through faith alone might give way to Catholic-style emphasis on works and sacraments, since divine blessing clearly manifested through bloodline and behavior rather than belief alone. Pentecostal movements might explode as believers sought their own supernatural manifestations to match Samson's descendants. Or perhaps Christianity would split into entirely new denominations based on different interpretations of divine power. Islam would experience equally profound disruption. The Quran's references to Jesus, Moses, and biblical events would need reinterpretation if those events occurred differently than previously understood. Islamic scholars would debate whether alternative Quranic revelations might exist, addressing different historical circumstances. The concept of progressive revelation might expand to include parallel revelations for alternative timelines. The 5 pillars of Islam might gain new interpretations. The pilgrimage to Mecca could be supplemented with pilgrimage to Jerusalem's ancient temple. Islamic law would need to address relationships with a Jewish kingdom that clearly enjoyed divine favor. Some Muslim communities might develop syncretic practices, incorporating elements of Samson's religious traditions. Judaism itself would be transformed beyond recognition. Instead of a religion shaped by exile, persecution, and longing for return, Jewish faith would have developed around continuous sovereignty and divine blessing. Talmudic literature would address completely different questions. The Passover celebration might focus on liberation from all oppression rather than specifically Egyptian bondage. Modern atheist and agnostic movements would face their greatest challenge. The existence of demonstrable supernatural power would force materialist philosophies to account for phenomena that clearly transcend natural law. Some skeptics might argue for advanced technology or unknown physics, but others would be forced to acknowledge genuine divine intervention in human affairs. Chapter 19: The Eternal Question. As we reach the end of this incredible journey through alternative history, we're left facing profound questions that cut to the heart of human existence. What does Samson's story really teach us about strength and weakness, about divine favor and human responsibility? In our timeline, Samson's fall serves as a warning about how even the greatest gifts can be lost through pride, lust, and betrayal. His story reminds us that true strength comes not from physical power, but from faithfulness to our calling. The tragedy of his downfall makes his final victory more meaningful, redemption purchased through suffering and sacrifice. But what if that lesson is incomplete? What if the alternative timeline shows us something equally important about the possibility of maintaining divine blessing through wisdom and obedience? Perhaps both stories are true simultaneously, teaching different aspects of the same spiritual reality. The question of free will becomes even more complex when we consider alternative possibilities. Did Samson have the power to choose a different path, or was his fate predetermined by divine plan? If alternative timelines exist where he made different choices, what does that mean for our own decisions and their consequences? Most challenging of all is the question of divine justice. In our world, good people suffer while evil people prosper, and we comfort ourselves with promises of ultimate justice in eternity. But what if divine justice can also manifest immediately through supernatural intervention? What if God sometimes does provide temporal blessing and protection for the faithful? The story forces us to examine our own relationship with power and responsibility. We live in an age where human strength has been multiplied through technology to almost godlike proportions. We can split atoms, manipulate genes, and reshape the earth itself. Are we using these powers wisely, or are we heading toward our own moment of tragic downfall? Perhaps the deepest question is whether strength and spirituality must be opposites. Our culture often assumes that true spiritual growth requires weakness, suffering, and humility. But Samson's alternative story suggests that divine power might be maintained through wisdom rather than lost through strength. Maybe the goal isn't to choose between power and spirituality, but to unite them through proper understanding. As we ponder these eternal questions, we realize that the story of Samson, whether tragic or triumphant, continues to speak to something fundamental in the human heart about our longing for meaning, purpose, and connection with the divine. Chapter 20: The Secret That Changes Everything. But what if everything we've explored isn't just speculation? What if hidden evidence suggests that some people believe this alternative timeline actually occurred, and that our current world is the result of supernatural intervention to restore what they call the correct timeline? Deep in government archives, classified documents speak of temporal anomalies that cannot be explained by conventional science. Project Looking Glass, a rumored CIA investigation from the 1970s, allegedly discovered evidence that multiple historical timelines exist simultaneously. According to leaked reports, investigators found artifacts and records that seem to come from alternative versions of biblical events. The documents describe encounters with individuals who possess detailed knowledge of historical events that never happened in our timeline, including specific details about Samson's kingdom, its architecture, its diplomatic relationships, and its eventual fate. These people aren't mentally ill or delusional. They pass every psychological test and demonstrate knowledge of ancient languages, customs, and technologies that they couldn't have learned from any earthly source. More disturbing are reports of physical evidence that shouldn't exist. Archaeological sites that appear and disappear overnight. Ancient texts written in languages that match no known historical script, but can somehow be read by certain individuals. Genetic markers in modern populations that suggest biological lineages extending far beyond recorded history. The most shocking revelation involves secret societies that claim to be working toward timeline restoration. These groups believe that reality was altered at some point in the past, and they're attempting to return history to its proper course. Some want to restore Samson's kingdom. Others are trying to prevent it from ever existing. The conflict between these factions supposedly influences major historical events in ways the public never realizes. Religious leaders from multiple faiths receive periodic reports about phenomena that suggest alternative spiritual realities bleeding through into our world. Miraculous healings that follow patterns described in suppressed ancient texts. Prophetic dreams that reference events from timelines that never happened. Physical manifestations of spiritual power that match descriptions of Samson's supernatural strength. The ultimate question becomes not whether alternative timelines exist, but whether someone or something has been manipulating history to ensure specific outcomes. Are we living in the timeline that naturally developed, or have divine forces or other powers intervened to create the world we know? As you consider everything we've explored today, ask yourself, what if the most incredible truth isn't that Samson might have kept his strength, but that he actually did, and someone changed history to make us forget? The next time you read the familiar story of Samson and Delilah, remember what you've learned here. Look for the signs that might indicate which timeline we're really living in. And consider the possibility that the greatest secrets of human history are hidden not in ancient tombs or lost cities, but in the space between what was, what is, and what might have been. The truth may be stranger than any fiction we can imagine, and closer than we dare to believe.